Hey guys, GP Jesus here. In this video we'll be discussing the supply of bonds in the bond market graph, along with its determinants and an acronym for it. So what we should first understand is that the supply of bonds is equivalent to the demand of loanable funds. The intuition really behind this is that people who sell bonds have a desire for cash, which they get by selling the bond, which is the same as borrowing in the demand of loanable funds. We won't be proving it in this video, but that should be some prerequisite knowledge for the content coming up ahead. So what can shift the supply of bonds? Well, here's the determinants, and there are three of them. The first determinant is the expected future profitability of investment. This might sound a little bit complicated, but let's mainly focus on the word profitability. When you make an investment, you want to make sure it's profitable, or else you could have just put your money into something else more profitable, right? Now, let's say the expected return on capital goods, which in this case investment is referring to capital goods, decreases. So this little factory will earn you less money than it did before. If the expected return decreases, you're going to get less out of it. It's less profitable. Your desire to then borrow funds to purchase the factory decreases, meaning demand of loanable funds then shifts to the left. Since demand of loanable funds is equivalent to the supply of bonds, it means supply of bonds will also shift to the left. As we can see, this is a direct relationship, as when EFPI decreased, so did supply of bonds. The next determinant we have is expected inflation. If we recall from the Fisher effect, an increase in expected inflation causes I to increase, since I is equal to R plus expected inflation. I'll be covering the derivation and reasoning in another video, but in short, when expected inflation increases, supply of loanable funds will decrease, while demand of loanable funds will increase. We look here, nominal interest rates has increased. So as we can see, when expected inflation increases, supply of bonds decreases, right? No, this is supply of loanable funds, which if we actually look to demand of loanable funds, which is equivalent to the supply of bonds actually increases. So there's also a direct relationship between the two. And finally, we have government budget deficits, which is basically a review of a concept in AP macroeconomics. You already know what a government budget deficit is. You've heard it all over the news. This is when government expenditures will exceed net tax revenue. For this fancy notation, G really just means government spending, while T is just net tax revenue. So then we can use G minus T to see if the government is running a deficit or a surplus. When G minus T is greater than 0, that means your spending is greater than your net tax revenue. So you're running a deficit. When G minus T is less than 0, which is often quite rare for many countries, tax revenue is greater than spending. And so you all in all get a surplus. Now how does this really relate to supply of bonds? Well, when the government is running a deficit, we already know that they usually don't fund it by raising taxes. They instead fund it by borrowing money and selling government bonds. Now let's think about this for a moment. When the government borrows, the demand for loanable funds will increase, as the government wants to borrow money. This makes sense. Demand for loanable funds is equivalent to supply of bonds. And so if demand of loanable funds increases, the supply of bonds will increase. So as we can see, when G minus T deficit increases, supply of bonds also increases. In other words, the government is selling more bonds, which shifts supply of bonds to the right. Both perspectives are essentially the same. Now, if you still don't really get how a government selling bonds can fund a deficit, what do you think happens when you buy a government security? Well, when you buy a government security, you give them cash. You're purchasing the bond, and they give you the bond. They use this cash to fund their government spending. So that's how they fund it. And so that's all of the determinants for supply of bonds. Now what's the GP Jesus acronym this time? The acronym is PIG. I use the main letters that make each determinant easily identifiable. So let's go through them all. We're going to use P for profitability, as that provides the core intuition behind EFPI. We then have I for inflation, which in whole we've already learned from the Fisher effect. And finally we have G to stand for government, or government budget deficits, which as deficits increase, also increases the supply of bonds, as they borrow money to fund these deficits. Many of the questions involving the asset approach are very similar, and often mimic supply and demand questions seen from Unit 1 on AP Macroeconomics. Let's try a quick practice problem, which we can use to show how to really use this acronym properly. I'll let you pause the video and read it for yourself. Try and complete it before I show how to do it. Alright, let's try and solve this. Using the PIG acronym, we can spot which determinants they're referring to. In this case, the nation Francia, which is at a balanced budget, when they start borrowing money, they start running a deficit. We also see the question explicitly state EFPI right here, and that is decreased. Both of these two determinants have a direct relationship to supply of bonds. And so if we move to the graphs and go one step at a time, we know that government deficits increasing will increase supply of bonds, so supply of bonds will shift to the right. But we also know that EFPI decreasing will shift supply of bonds to the left. So wait, does that mean that the answer is indeterminate? Well, if we look back at the question, it says that Benny notices G minus T's impact is less than that of EFPI. And so if we redraw the shifting, the shift to the right will actually be less than the shift to the left. And so all in all, supply of bonds shifts to the left. So if we draw a line to the right, we see that interest rates have increased. Except it doesn't. As we need to remember, this is the bond market graph. On the y-axis is price of bonds, which we need to look at the loanable funds market, where the y-axis of that is interest rates. The shifts would be the same for each equivalent curve. Since demand of bonds doesn't move, supply of loanable funds doesn't move. Supply of bonds, on the other hand, overall shifts to the left. And so we'd see a shift to the left in demand of loanable funds as well. Now if we look at the graph, we'll see that interest rates have actually decreased. And so would the quantity of loanable funds, but this is the main part we care about. So Benny, that's the answer, and we used the PIG acronym to solve it. So that's all I have for this video. If it helped you out, leave a like. If it didn't, leave a dislike. If you didn't catch a concept or something didn't make sense, watch the video again. GP Jesus out, I died for your grades.